Hello everyone, welcome back to Krish Course Tell Us Scary Night Sleep Story. Like, subscribe my channel, enjoy. Let's start. The mysterious cabin at night. It was a cold, dark night. The sky was shrouded in thick clouds, hiding the moon, while the faint glow of distant stars barely illuminated the dense forest. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. Amidst this eerie stillness stood a lonely cabin, its wooden structure weathered by time. From its open doorway, an unnatural red light poured out, cutting through the surrounding darkness like a sinister beacon. Ayesha, a 29-year-old wildlife photographer, was out exploring the forest for her latest project. Her goal was to capture rare nocturnal animals in their natural habitat. She had set up camp not far from where the cabin now stood in view. Looking through her binoculars, she noticed the glow for the first time and frowned. The forest was supposed to be deserted. This area had been marked as uninhabited for years. Who could be living here? She wondered aloud. Curiosity got the better of her. Armed with her flashlight and camera, she decided to investigate. As she approached the cabin, the sense of foreboding grew stronger. The path was overgrown and uneven, and the trees seemed to close in around her, their skeletal branches reaching out like claws. The air became colder with each step, and she could feel the weight of the silence pressing on her. When she finally reached the cabin, she noticed strange details. The wooden walls were covered in odd carvings, symbols that looked ancient and unfamiliar. The red light streaming from inside seemed alive, pulsating like a heartbeat. Ayesha hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but the pull of the unknown was too strong. As she stepped closer, she could hear faint whispers. At first, they were barely audible, but as she approached the doorway, they grew louder. They weren't in any language she could understand, low, guttural, and filled with an otherworldly resonance. Her hand trembled as she pushed the creaky door open. Inside, the cabin was almost empty, except for a single wooden table in the center. On it lay an old book, its leather cover cracked with age. The red light seemed to emanate from the book itself, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Against her better judgment, Ayesha reached out and opened the book. Its pages were filled with more of the strange symbols she had seen outside, but as she stared at them, the symbols began to shift and change, forming words in a language she could now understand. You have been chosen. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind her, plunging the cabin into complete darkness, except for the ominous red glow of the book. The whispers grew louder, now sounding as though they were coming from all around her. Panic set in. But when Ayesha tried to move, she found herself frozen in place. The pages of the book began turning on their own, faster and faster, until they stopped at a page with a vivid, moving illustration, a figure that looked exactly like her, standing in the same cabin, bathed in red light. The last thing she saw before the light consumed her was her reflection in the book's pages, her eyes glowing the same red as the room. Weeks later, a group of hikers discovered the cabin. It was empty except for the old book, still glowing faintly red. One of them reached out to touch it, and the whispers began anew. The mysterious cabin at night. It was a cold, dark night. The sky was shrouded in thick clouds, hiding the moon, while the faint glow of distant stars barely illuminated the dense forest. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. In the heart of this vast wilderness stood a lonely cabin, its wooden structure weathered by time and neglect. From its open doorway, an unnatural red light spilled out, painting the surrounding ground in an eerie glow. Ayesha, a 29-year-old wildlife photographer, had set up camp in this forest to document nocturnal animals for her latest project. She was used to being alone in remote areas, but something about tonight felt different. Earlier that day, she had noticed strange claw marks on tree trunks and faint, untraceable footprints in the dirt marks that didn't match any animal she knew. As the night deepened, Ayesha sat in her tent, reviewing her photos. That's when she noticed the light. From the corner of her eye, a flickering red glow pierced the darkness. She turned off her flashlight and peered through her binoculars. In the distance, through the trees, she could see the cabin. It wasn't marked on her map, and the forest rangers had assured her this area was uninhabited. Her curiosity piqued. "What is that place?" she murmured to herself. Against her better judgment, she decided to investigate. She grabbed her camera, a flashlight, and her notebook, and set off toward the mysterious glow. The forest seemed to grow colder and darker as she walked, the trees towering above her like silent sentinels. Each step felt heavier, as though the ground itself was resisting her approach. As Ayesha neared the cabin, she noticed how unnaturally still everything had become. The usual sounds of the forest, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, the distant call of an owl, were completely absent. The silence was deafening. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped closer. The cabin's wooden exterior was covered in strange carvings, symbols that seemed both ancient and otherworldly. The red light pulsed softly like a heartbeat, casting shadows that danced across the surrounding trees. When she finally reached the door, she paused. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but her curiosity was stronger. She pushed the door open with a creak, and the scene inside made her breath catch. The cabin was nearly empty, with only a single wooden table in the center. On it lay an ancient, leather-bound book. The book seemed to be the source of the red light, which pulsed and flickered like a living thing. The walls of the cabin were lined with more of the strange carvings, and the air was thick with an unexplainable energy. Ayesha stepped inside, her camera clicking as she took photos of the room. She approached the table, her eyes fixed on the book. Its cover was cracked and worn, but the symbols etched into it glowed faintly, as if alive. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the book. Then, as if compelled by an unseen force, she opened it. The pages were filled with more of the strange symbols she had seen outside, but as she stared at them, they began to shift and rearrange themselves, forming words she could read. "You have been chosen. The gate awaits." Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her with a force that shook the cabin. The red light intensified, bathing the room in a pulsating glow. The air grew colder, and Ayesha felt a chill run down her spine. The symbols on the walls began to glow as well, their light pulsating in sync with the book. The pages of the book began to flip on their own, faster and faster, until they stopped at a single page. On it was a vivid illustration, a figure that looked exactly like her, standing in the same cabin, bathed in red light. The image was so lifelike it seemed to move, her reflection in the book mirroring her every move. Panic gripped her. She tried to move, but her body wouldn't respond. The whispers she had heard faintly outside now filled the room, growing louder and more insistent. They seemed to come from the walls, the book, the very aura around her. The light from the book grew brighter, enveloping her completely. She felt as though she were being pulled into the pages themselves. Her surroundings blurred and shifted, and suddenly she was no longer in the cabin. She stood in a vast, empty void, the red light now a distant glow. The whispers were louder here, almost deafening. Shadows began to form around her, taking on humanoid shapes with glowing red eyes. A deep, guttural voice echoed through the void. "Welcome, Keeper. Your time has come." Aisha's mind raced. Keeper? Time for what? But before she could speak, the ground beneath her gave way and she fell into darkness. Weeks later, a group of hikers stumbled upon the cabin. It was empty, save for the book lying on the table. Its pages were blank, but the red glow remained. One of the hikers reached out to touch it, and the whispers began anew. The cycle had started again. The mysterious cabin at night. It was a cold, moonless night, and the forest was drenched in silence. Thick clouds hung low in the sky, shrouding the stars in darkness. The trees stood like ancient guardians, their branches clawing at the sky. Somewhere deep within this isolated forest, a single cabin stood, its wooden frame hidden by shadows. But what made it truly unusual was the glow, a pulsing, eerie red light spilling out from its doorway. Aisha, a 29-year-old wildlife photographer, was alone in the forest. She had ventured here to document nocturnal animals, her passion since childhood. She loved the quiet of nature and the thrill of discovering life hidden in the shadows. But this time the forest felt different. There was an unsettling stillness, a feeling that someone or something was watching her. Earlier in the evening, she had noticed peculiar signs. Unusually large claw marks scratched deep into tree trunks, trails of disturbed leaves that didn't match any animal she knew, and a strange hum in the air, barely audible but persistent. She had dismissed these as tricks of her overactive imagination. After all, she was deep in the wilderness, far from civilization. As the night deepened, she sat in her tent, reviewing her photos. It was then that she noticed it, the red glow. She turned off her flashlight and peered out through the tent flap. In the distance, through the dense forest, she saw a faint light flickering between the trees. Grabbing her binoculars, she focused on the source and saw the outline of a cabin she had never seen before. This place is supposed to be abandoned, she thought. Her map didn't show any structure nearby. The sight filled her with equal parts curiosity and dread. Against her better judgment, Aisha decided to investigate. Packing her camera, a flashlight, and her notebook, she stepped out into the night. The journey to the cabin was unnerving. The forest seemed alive, but not in a way that brought comfort. The usual sounds of crickets, rustling leaves, and distant animals were gone. Instead, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of her boots on the forest floor. Shadows seemed to shift at the corners of her vision, but when she turned, nothing was there. After what felt like hours, she finally reached the cabin. It stood in a small clearing, its wooden walls old and cracked, covered in strange carvings that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. The red glow spilling from the doorway bathed the clearing in an unnatural light, casting shadows that moved as if alive. Her heart raced as she approached. The symbols etched into the wood were like nothing she had seen before. They looked ancient, almost alien. She traced one with her finger, and a sudden chill ran up her spine. Steeling herself, Aisha pushed open the door. Inside, the cabin was almost bare. A thick, The mysterious cabin at night. It was a cold, moonless night, and the dense forest was veiled in an almost unnatural darkness. The heavy clouds in the sky smothered the faintest trace of starlight, leaving the forest floor in shadow. The trees, tall and gnarled, loomed like silent watchers, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. Amid this desolation stood a lone cabin, tucked away in a forgotten clearing. Its weathered walls seemed to whisper stories of abandonment, but the faint, pulsing red glow emanating from within betrayed a darker secret. Ayesha, a 29-year-old wildlife photographer, had been camped nearby for 2 nights. She had ventured into this remote forest, her gear packed with hopes of capturing rare nocturnal creatures. Photography had always been her solace, a way to lose herself in the quiet rhythms of nature. But tonight, the forest didn't feel right. There was an uneasy silence, the kind that burrowed deep into her skin and set her nerves on edge. Earlier that day, she had stumbled upon strange signs that she couldn't explain. Deep claw marks gouged into tree trunks, as though some massive creature had marked its territory. On the ground, faint tracks zigzagged through the underbrush, neither human nor animal, but something in between. She had paused to photograph them, her logical mind brushing aside the growing discomfort. As the hours passed, the unease only grew. By the time night fell, Ayesha found herself struggling to focus on her work. She sat in her tent, flipping through the photos on her camera, when she first noticed it, a faint red glow flickering in the distance. She frowned and reached for her binoculars. Peering through the lens, she saw it clearly now. A cabin nestled in the forest. Its light pulsed softly, almost as if alive, seeping out of the open doorway like a sinister invitation. Her map didn't mark any structure nearby, and the forest ranger she had spoken to before her trip had assured her this area was deserted. "This shouldn't be here," she whispered to herself. Curiosity mixed with a deep, gnawing sense of dread. Ayesha knew she should stay put, but the pull of the unknown was too strong. Grabbing her camera, flashlight, and notebook, she stepped out into the chilly night air, her breath misting in the cold. The forest felt different as she made her way toward the cabin. Each step seemed heavier, as though the earth itself resisted her. The trees appeared closer together, their branches tangling above her, blocking out what little light there was. The usual sounds of the forest, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, were gone. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of her boots on the forest floor, and the faint hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. As Ayesha drew closer, the red light grew brighter, its pulsing rhythm matching the beating of her heart. The cabin emerged fully into view, and she stopped in her tracks. Its wooden walls were ancient and weathered, covered in strange carvings. Symbols and sigils, etched deeply into the wood, glowed faintly as if reacting to her presence. She traced one with her flashlight, her fingers itching to document it in her notebook, but an unshakable fear kept her hand frozen. The air around the cabin felt charged, electric, and heavy. Each breath felt labored, as though the very atmosphere was pressing against her chest. Ayesha reached for her camera and snapped a few photos. The flash seemed to disturb the shadows, which flickered unnaturally at the edges of her vision. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar, the red light spilling out into the clearing. She stood frozen for a moment, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But curiosity had always been her greatest strength and her greatest weakness. She tightened her grip on her flashlight and stepped inside. The cabin's interior was as unsettling as its exterior. The room was bare except for a single wooden table in the center. On it lay an old, leather-bound book, its cover cracked and weathered with age. The source of the red light was unmistakable now it pulsed from the book, casting shifting shadows on the walls. Ayesha's eyes darted around the room. The walls were covered in more of the strange carvings, their lines glowing faintly, almost alive. The air was thick, filled with a low, droning hum that seemed to vibrate in her bones. She approached the table slowly, her footsteps echoing in the small space. The book seemed to call to her, an invisible pull drawing her closer. She hesitated, her hand hovering above the leather cover. Then, with a deep breath, she opened it. The pages were filled with strange symbols, similar to those carved into the walls. At first they meant nothing to her, but as she stared, the symbols began to shift and rearrange themselves. Words formed on the page, written in a language she shouldn't have been able to understand, yet somehow did. "You have been chosen. The gate awaits." A sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind her, and the red light flared, filling the room with an almost blinding glow. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, their lines pulsing in rhythm with the book. The hum grew louder, transforming into whispers that filled the room. Ayesha tried to move, but her body wouldn't respond. The pages of the book began turning on their own, faster and faster, until they stopped on a page with an illustration. Her breath caught in her throat. The image was of her, standing in the same cabin, bathed in the same red light. The drawing was unnervingly detailed, down to the camera slung around her neck and the fear etched on her face. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing. The air grew colder, and Ayesha's vision blurred. She felt as though she were being pulled into the book itself, her surroundings dissolving into a vortex of red light and shadow. When the light finally faded, the cabin was empty. The book lay closed on the table, its red glow dimming but not disappearing. Weeks later, a group of hikers stumbled upon the cabin. They found it untouched, the book still on the table. One of them, drawn by the faint red glow, reached out to open it. The whispers began again. The cycle had started anew. The vanished photographer. The hikers who stumbled upon the cabin were an adventurous group of friends. Amir, Sarah, and Danish, who had decided to explore the uncharted forest. None of them had heard the stories about the place, nor did they know about Ayesha's disappearance weeks earlier. The glowing red light seeping from the book intrigued them, though it should have sent them running. Amir was the first to step forward, drawn by the strange pull of the glowing book. "What is this?" he muttered, running his fingers across the leather cover. The moment he touched it, a chill coursed through his body. "Let's not mess with this," Sarah said nervously, glancing around the room. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The carvings on the walls seemed to shift and move when she wasn't looking directly at them. But Danish, ever the skeptic, laughed. "Come on, Sarah. It's probably just some old ritual stuff left by a weirdo. There's no such thing as ghosts." Ignoring Sarah's protests, Amir opened the book. The pages flipped violently as if an unseen hand were guiding them. A faint hum filled the room, growing louder with each passing second. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, casting flickering shadows that danced in unnatural ways. "Guys, this "This isn't normal," Amir said, his voice trembling. The book stopped on a page. The three leaned closer to look at the illustration, and what they saw chilled them to their core. It was an image of them, Amir, Sarah, and Danish, standing exactly as they were now, inside the same cabin. The red light on the page seemed to ripple like water, making the image look alive. "We need to leave," Sarah said, backing toward the door. But the cabin had other plans. The door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls, and the red light flared, blinding them. The hum grew into a deafening roar, and the symbols on the walls began to pulse like a heartbeat. The shift. When the light faded, the three found themselves no longer in the cabin. They were outside, but the forest was different. The trees were taller and darker, their twisted branches forming a canopy so thick that not even a sliver of light could break through. The air was thick with fog, and an unnatural silence surrounded them. "Where are we?" Danish asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah looked around, panic rising in her chest. This isn't the forest we came from." Amir pointed toward a faint light in the distance. "Look, over there." The light was faint and flickering, like a lantern swaying in the wind. With no other option, the three began walking toward it. The journey was harrowing. The forest seemed alive, its trees shifting and groaning as if they were moving to block their path. Shadows darted between the trees, but whenever, it sounded like a woman. Amir and Sarah exchanged a glance before stepping cautiously toward the cabin. Danish stayed back, his skepticism shaken, but his fear holding him in place. The voice of Ayesha. Inside the cabin, the red light pulsed erratically, casting long, menacing shadows. The book lay open on the table, its pages turning on their own. The voice came again, clearer now. "Help me. I'm trapped." Sarah's eyes widened. "It's a woman's voice. We have to find her." The three of them entered, and as they did, the door slammed shut behind them once more. The carvings on the walls began to glow brighter, and the whispers returned, filling the room with an otherworldly hum. Amir approached the book. On its open page was a drawing of a woman, her face filled with terror. It was Ayesha. The caption beneath the image read, "The first sacrifice, the gatekeeper." Before they could react, the red light flared again, and the room seemed to dissolve around them. The walls faded into darkness, and they found themselves standing in a vast, empty space. Above them, the sky was a swirling mass of red and black, filled with countless glowing symbols. Standing in the center of this void was Ayesha. Her form was translucent, as if she were a ghost. She looked at them with pleading eyes. "Please, you have to destroy the book," she said. "It's the key to this place. It's feeding on us." Before they could respond, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the void. The ground beneath them began to tremble, and massive shadows began to rise from the edges of the space. They took the shape of monstrous, clawed creatures with glowing red eyes. "Run!" Ayesha screamed. The final escape. The three friends turned and ran, the monstrous shadows closing in around them. The void seemed endless, the ground shifting beneath their feet. The whispers grew louder, turning into a cacophony of voices chanting in an unknown language. Amir clutched the book tightly, realizing it was their only chance. "If we destroy it, will this end?" he shouted. "Yes," Ayesha's voice echoed around them. Without hesitation, Amir opened the book and began tearing out its pages. Each page he destroyed sent a ripple through the void, and the creatures let out unearthly shrieks. But the book seemed endless, its pages multiplying faster than he could tear them. Sarah grabbed a torch from her bag and lit it. "Burn it," she screamed. Amir threw the book to the ground, and Sarah set it alight. The fire spread quickly, consuming the pages in a blaze of red and black. The void around them began to collapse, the creatures dissolving into smoke. The last thing they saw was Ayesha's face, her expression one of gratitude before the light consumed everything. Epilogue. The three woke up in the forest, just outside the cabin. The sun was rising, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. The cabin was gone, leaving nothing but an empty clearing. They never spoke of what had happened that night, but they all knew one thing. They had been chosen for something far beyond their understanding. And though they had escaped, they could still feel the pull of the cabin, lurking in the shadows of their memories. Somewhere, deep in another forest, the book waits for its next visitors. The awakening of shadows. After their escape from the void, Amir, Sarah, and Danish tried to return to their normal lives, but the events of that night haunted them. They could no longer sleep without the memory of Ayesha's ghostly face, or the whispers of the monstrous creatures echoing in their ears. A week after their return, Amir began to notice strange occurrences. Shadows in his room seemed to stretch unnaturally, even when there was no source of light to cast them. Sarah reported hearing faint whispers calling her name when she was alone, and Danish started having vivid nightmares of the cabin reappearing in a different forest. One evening, Amir received an envelope with no return address. Inside was an old photograph of the cabin, now fully intact, with the words, "The story never ends." The return to the forest, terrified but unwilling to let the mystery consume them, Sarah and Danish decided to return to the forest to investigate. Armed with torches, cameras, and basic supplies, they retraced their steps to the clearing where the cabin had once stood. To their shock, the cabin was there again, as if nothing had happened. This time, it looked even older, its walls covered in vines and moss. The red glow was gone, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to suffocate the air around them. What if burning the book wasn't enough? Sarah whispered, gripping her flashlight tightly. Amir stepped forward. We need to find out what's still tying this place to, whatever that was. Inside, the cabin was in ruins. The table where the book had been was shattered, and the carvings on the walls were faded. But in the center of the room lay a small black stone. It pulsed faintly with a cold blue light. Sarah hesitated. This wasn't there before. Amir knelt to examine the stone, but as he reached out to touch it, the floorboards beneath him trembled. The carvings on the walls began to glow again, not red this time, but a pale, icy blue. Dana shouted, "Guys, we need to leave." But it was too late. The moment Amir touched the stone, the world around them shifted once more, the realm of endless dusk. The three friends found themselves in a new dimension, a landscape of perpetual twilight, where the horizon stretched endlessly. The air was cold and still, and the ground was made of smooth black glass. In the distance, towering spires of shadow reached into a sky filled with swirling, glowing symbols. "This is different," Sarah murmured, her voice trembling. Before they could decide their next move, a figure appeared in the distance. It was Ayesha. But she was different now. Her translucent form was gone, replaced by a physical body that seemed to flicker between human and shadow. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. Amir stepped forward. "We destroyed the book. Why is this still happening?" Ayesha's expression was unreadable. The book was only a key, one of many. You've opened a door that cannot be closed, and now you've brought them here." As she spoke, the glassy ground beneath them began to crack, and from the fissures emerged shadowy figures with glowing blue eyes. Their movements were slow but deliberate, and their presence exuded an overwhelming sense of dread. "What do we do?" Danish yelled, backing away. Ayesha extended her hand. "The stone. It's a shard of the anchor keeping this realm alive. You must destroy it, but doing so will come at a cost." "What cost?" Amir asked, clutching the stone tightly. "This realm and the creatures within it feed on human fear and memories. Destroying the shard will erase all traces of this place, including the memories tied to it." Sarah froze. "You mean will you forget everything? Even you?" Ayesha nodded solemnly. "It's the only way. If you don't, this realm will bleed into your world, and the shadows will consume everything. The ultimate sacrifice." With the shadowy creatures closing in, Amir, Sarah, and Danish had no time to debate. Amir held the stone high, and Sarah handed him the hammer from her pack. "Do it," Danish urged, his voice breaking. Amir hesitated, glancing at Ayesha one last time. "What will happen to you?" A faint smile crossed her face. "I was lost the moment I entered that cabin. This is my only chance to truly be free." With a deep breath, Amir brought the hammer down on the stone. The moment it shattered, a blinding light engulfed the realm. The creatures let out ear-piercing shrieks as they dissolved into the air, and the spires of shadow crumbled into dust. Ayesha's form began to fade, and her voice echoed softly. "Thank you, and goodbye." A new beginning. Amir, Sarah, and Danish woke up in a hospital room. A park ranger had found them unconscious near the edge of the forest. None of them could remember what had happened, or why they were there. The memories of the cabin, Ayesha, and the shadowy realm were gone, leaving only a faint sense of unease they couldn't explain. The forest, too, seemed different. The clearing where the cabin had stood was now overgrown with wildflowers, and there was no trace of the eerie structure. As the friends tried to move on with their lives, a single thought lingered in Amir's mind, a fragment of a dream he couldn't quite piece together. A glowing stone, a smiling face, and the words, "The story never ends." Somewhere, deep in the heart of another forgotten forest, the shadows waited for their next visitors. Thanks for watching.